couple of weeks ago, you said something about quote unquote needed suffering for salvation. Could you please elaborate a bit more on this? And this is Gabriella.
Right. Gabriella, the one thing, about suffering being needed, I'm sure there are some people who are almost angelic by nature. I do have some rather remarkable sisters, but I have to say, though, suffering has always been very, very important to me. So I'll speak about myself in particular, and it was very important to St. Paul in order for us to sort of get to that stage of love where we were sort of free from what we might call inordinate attachments and from a very raised ego. And I must say, I've got my elevated ego, and suffering has been indispensable for bringing me down a few pegs there. I was saying in a previous episode that I thought St. Paul really had a vision problem, as I do, and I think he called that a thorn in the flesh, and he thought that the reason his thorn in the flesh was so important to him was it kind of made him diminish, the old ego diminish, the old sort of narcissistic instinct diminish, and made the presence of Christ in him, the presence of Christ crucified in him, made that very strong. So it built him up in faith, and it built him up in humility, and it built him up in empathy for other people. And I think St. Paul, felt the same way I do. I think narcissism is a darkness that makes, nothing's, there's no suffering worse than being caught in the darkness of narcissism, than being caught in the darkness of ego, than being caught in the darkness of having to have dominion over other people, being caught in the darkness of self-worship. And frankly, the more sensitivity and education and talent you have, I just have to tell you, the darkness is really dark. And then there's blessed suffering. Because, of course, the minute that suffering comes in, you start asking questions. You start asking what the meaning of life is. You start asking the Lord how you can improve things. You start looking at yourself in a very good and critical way. You start turning to God in faith, right? All these things start opening up. And in fact, when times are good, I'm almost resisting ever asking these questions, right? I don't have the guts. I mean, there are some people who do have the guts. I'm not one of them. I kind of, things are going okay, why raise these questions, but boy, when the suffering hits, I just get so much benefit from it. I do ask all the right questions, and when that begins to happen, I do let God in ever more deeply. I do see myself and my heart conforming to the Beatitudes more and more. It really makes a difference. I don't stop being an egoist. Right. I've got my moments, I'll tell you, but boy, I'll tell you, suffering has really diminished the influence.
Well, let me ask you, Father, just not to get off track here, but because I thought it was interesting your comment about what you saw was the thorn in the side for St. Paul. And do you think that's related in your mind, or is your sense of that because you have the Damascus Road experience and his vision was affected at that point in time as to why that continued to be a problem, or what was it?
I think it did continue to be a problem, or something like it. Because, why would he have told the Galatians, I know you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me if you could have? How does that make any sense, except that maybe Paul has an eye problem? Or that wonderful episode at the end, toward the end of the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul's being interrogated by this high priest, and the high priest comes into the room, and Paul says, what would you have of me, you whitewashed wall? And the attendant says, is that any way to talk to the high priest? And Paul goes, excuse me, sir, I didn't know you were the high priest. Now, how could a former Pharisee not recognize the high priest? And why would he call him a whitewashed wall? So, there's all these little clues, again, in the Galatians, I'm going to have somebody else finish off this letter for me. I'm writing to you in big print, and so forth. You're thinking to yourself, this guy sounds like me. there's some kind of a struggle going on with his eyes. And so I always thought that, I mean, there's no definitive evidence that, maybe I've got a totally wrong interpretation of all these passages, but I sort of looked at all the evidence, combined them with the Damascus experience, and said, maybe he had something wrong with his eyes.
Right. Interesting.
Maybe I shouldn't call it a vision problem. Paul's vision was excellent. It was his eyesight that was probably poor.
It's a good stipulation on that point.